kindly note that the views and opinions shared in this video are those of the speaker and do not constitute advice given by Classic Private Wealth. Any advice given by Classic Private Wealth will be in writing in the form of a wealth management proposal. Classic Private Wealth is an authorized financial services provider.
The first thing is that it's extremely contagious, and one of the things that makes it, two things that makes it contagious. The one is it seems to live in droplets that you exhale. So whenever you come close to anyone exhaling, if that person had the virus, you might catch it. And the second thing that makes it very contagious is that people present with it at a fairly late stage. So you seem to have the virus for about 10 days before it actually presents in terms of symptoms. But in those 10 days, you're already contagious. So people are contagious, but they don't know it. And that's, that combination makes it a virus that spreads very, very easily. And we actually see that around the world, health workers have contracted the virus. In most countries, you find that health workers have not been free of the virus. So even though they wear all the protective clothing, etc., they still catch the virus. So an extremely contagious virus, which means that typically you would expect that it travels like a seasonal flu, and a seasonal flu typically infects somewhere between 60 and 80% of the population. So you would expect that if you take no extraordinary measures, 60 to 80% of the population will come down with the virus. So extremely widely spread. And then the last thing about the virus that's actually the thing that makes it so dangerous and unique is that it, of all the highly contagious things, it's actually much more deadly in the sense that it has quite a high mortality rate. Now, mortality rates are very difficult to calculate because you've got to see you first have to test accurately in your general population how many people have it before you can accurately tell what the mortality is. But just to give you an idea of mortality, seasonal flu typically has a mortality rate of 0.01%, meaning about 1 in 1,000 people who are contracted will die normally of flu in a normal year. It looks like for this coronavirus, we may have a mortality rate of somewhere between 0.8% and 2%, depending on kind of which stats you believe. So basically, somewhere between 8 and 20 times as many people would die of a coronavirus epidemic as would die of the normal flu. So in a completely different category from normal flu. And one of the interesting things, if we can get the graph up maybe about the mortality rates, one of the interesting things is that coronavirus attacks older people much more strongly than younger people. But you know the story about the actuary who drowned in a river that was on average 3 feet deep? Please. So, tragically reading yesterday about the 5-year-old girl who died of coronavirus in the US. So children even do get affected. But what you will see if you look on, we're just trying to get the right graph to display. You should be seeing the graph with the bubbles, smaller bubbles to the left and bigger bubbles to the right. What you see there is that the bubbles to the right become quite large. So if you're over 80 years old and you contract the virus, you have between a 10 and a 20% chance of dying of it. And we know that Boris Johnson, who's a lot younger, he falls into the 50 to 59 category, like me. He came very close to dying. If it wasn't for the fact that they had the very best medical care for the Prime Minister in Britain, he most probably would have died. So younger people can also die. And even from roughly 50, the mortality rate becomes quite upsetting. So what you see is that it's not acceptable in virtually any society we know of to just allow the virus to run through the population and allow a large percentage of old people to die. Because if you think that 60% of the older population will get infected and 20% of those infected will die, that's quite a large chunk of your old population that dies. So completely unacceptable in any normal society these days. So what we see is that governments will go to great lengths to prevent this virus from spreading into the general population. And the thing that we know works in terms of containing this, the epidemics that spread in individual countries, is you can lock down your society, meaning you have a kind of stay-at-home order, as they call it in the United States, where people are not allowed to move around and to come into contact with other people, because that's essentially what leads to the spread of the virus. And if you then get a contagion rate of less than 1, that means every person who gets it spreads it to less than 1 other person, the epidemic dies down. If it stays more than 1, then it spreads like a virus. If you like, there's a reason why they have got the saying that something goes viral. It means it spreads extremely quickly. So typically, if you leave this, every single person will actually infect 3 others, and then you have you have a very fast spread of the infection. So a very small number of infections can grow into a very large number very quickly. So at this point, we've got no cure for the illness, meaning if you get the coronavirus, basically medical science can do very little for you. They can help you somewhat if you get to the stage where it attacks your lungs and you have a shortage of oxygen. You can get oxygen additions, and you can then be put onto a ventilator. And that's about what they can do for you. And the stats we have still say that roughly 20% of people who contract the virus will need to be hospitalized. And of the 20%, 5 will need to go into intensive care. And pretty much that 5% will need ventilators. Otherwise, they will die. Now, there are all kinds of problems with being put on a ventilator. Just being put on a ventilator is a dangerous thing all by itself. So your ability to survive once you go onto a ventilator is not all that high, even in the current circumstances, but it's much better than if you don't get a ventilator. So what this means is that if you just work through the numbers and you have a couple of thousand ventilators, and you think about the number of people that could get infected, what we also see is that in those countries where the healthcare system gets overwhelmed and they can't treat patients, the mortality rate roughly doubles of the virus. So part of what governments around the world are trying to do is to so-called flatten the curve, meaning they are trying to make sure that they don't get everybody ill at the same time, so they've got capacity to treat the very ill people in the hospitals. So if we can go to the flattening the curve graphs, I think that the whole flattening the curve thing has been a little bit of a red herring, in the sense that what people would typically do is they would put up a graph. I'll show you the graph in a second. That shows how you've got certain capacity to treat people. The graph will come up in a second. And then what happens is that if everybody gets ill at the same time, you will vastly exceed the number of the treatments will be. We're just getting the graph up. But so the idea is to say that if you could just allow people to get the virus in a little bit of a slower fashion, you can actually allow it to spread through, there we go. You should be seeing a red graph and a blue graph. And if you are like 20% of males colorblind, you'll know that the steep one is the red one, and the flatter one is the blue one. So the idea is that you've got a certain healthcare system capacity. If everybody gets the virus at the same time, you exceed that capacity, but if you can spread it out a little bit, you can treat everybody who's vulnerable. The problem with that graph is actually that the line of healthcare capacity is drawn in a completely unrealistic way. So if we go to the next graph, you will see this is what it actually looks like. That red line there at the bottom, that's the capacity to treat people in intensive care with ventilators. And the black line that's the peak line is the one that says you just allow the virus to spread. So you can see that you actually have very little capacity, and no matter how you play it, you're going to exceed that capacity very easily. So in essence, what happens is that in the world, we just don't have anywhere near the capacity to treat people that would be needed if we allowed the virus to spread. So what countries do is they go into lockdown of some sort, and fairly strict lockdown. And we know that that works. So within about 3 weeks of going into lockdown, all of these curves start to flatten. And after about 2 months of lockdown, the virus is basically dead if you can maintain the lockdown strict enough. So that's what happens, is that some countries go into lockdown early, so like Singapore, lockdown very quickly, so they never really had an epidemic. Countries like Italy and the United States went into lockdown late, so they have quite serious epidemics in those countries. Britain among them went into lockdown far too late, and so they get fairly serious epidemics. But once the epidemic spreads and people start dying, they actually do go into lockdown, and then a couple of weeks later, the viral spread stops or goes much lower, and eventually they bring the virus under control. The problem with bringing the virus under control is that once the virus is under control, you're not out of the woods. So maybe let's just take the graphs off for the moment. The problem that you have is that once you've locked down and you've brought your epidemic under control, first of all, there's typically still a couple of cases around in your country, but you also have communications with other countries who haven't locked down as strictly, so you can re-import the virus, and you only need 2 or 3 cases to come in order to spread the virus and become hundreds of thousands in a very, very short period of time. So what you need to do is, once you've actually brought your own epidemic under control, you've got to keep things under control. So what we're seeing now is that people are starting to talk about stages of lockdown. So the Tony Blair Foundation, for instance, have come out with a plan that they say this is the plan according to which countries should manage their lockdowns. So they talk about hard lockdown, which is the initial stage where you're trying to get your epidemic under control. And then they talk about a second phase of soft lockdown. So if you read about Wuhan in China opening, it means that basically that they're going from hard lockdown to soft lockdown, meaning they still have lots of social distancing rules, but those rules are now being applied in a slightly less strict fashion. My own view is that what we should do is we should really, in that second stage, go to something called intelligent lockdown, meaning you only lock down those things that really have to be locked down. For instance, if you think about it, it's clear that playing golf could be something that where you can maintain a fair amount of social distancing. So if you're playing golf with in your four-ball, you only have people from your own household. It's as good as being in lockdown, and it would be very good for your mental health to play a bit of golf. So in an intelligent lockdown environment, you'll be allowed to play golf under carefully controlled conditions. So the idea would be that you come out of the strict lockdown, but you carefully control what happens in the next stage. And therefore you keep that under control. And then eventually, according to the Blair Foundation, you go into something called soft open, meaning that everything is open in principle, except with some rules about taking care still in place. So you go through it in 3 stages. Now, the question is, what brings us out on the other side? What brings us completely out of lockdown? And there are basically 2 conditions under which the lockdown would be removed completely. The one is you get something called herd immunity, meaning you've got so many people in your population that is not subject to getting the virus again, that the virus stops spreading, and therefore you get small little outbreaks, but you don't actually get an epidemic again. And to enable this, you need about 60% of people in the population to have some resistance to the virus. So if you just allow the virus to spread through the population and you allow 60 to 80% of people to catch the virus, a lot of people will die, but the remaining people will have resistance and the epidemic will be past you. So this process, if uncluttered and not interfered with in terms of lockdown, would typically take 3 to 4 months. So you can leave the virus, let it run for 3 to 4 months, and you're out on the other side. And it's interesting that the British briefly played around with the idea of allowing the virus to spread through Britain and getting herd immunity. In fact, Boris Johnson made an announcement to that effect, but he reversed that announcement within a couple of days when people started getting ill. So what we find is that the strategy of just allowing herd immunity to go through the population has some popular appeal, but as soon as people start dying, that decision is typically reversed. But what then happens, so I'll come back to the whole herd immunity issue. But the second thing is that you could end this if there was an effective treatment that allowed vulnerable people to be treated with this effective treatment. I think there's something called remdesivir, an antiviral medicine that they've had some success with. So people are working extremely hard to find a medicine that you can give to people ill with the virus that would ameliorate the symptoms and allow a much higher percentage of people to survive. So if you had that medicine, that would allow opening up of your economy. The other possibility is that if you had a vaccine and you vaccinated a large percentage of the population, that would also allow you to open up your economy. Now, the best science we have is still the statement from the head of Johnson & Johnson. So they're working really hard on a vaccine. We hear about a couple of vaccines worldwide going into human trials right now. So we're already seeing those things entering the first phases of human trials. But his comment was that if this is successful, we'll have a vaccine roughly by the end of the year, and then we'll have millions of doses of vaccine roughly by February, March, and we'll have billions of doses of vaccine roughly by the middle of 2021. Now, again, this is a worldwide pandemic, so if you're going to contain it through vaccination, you need billions of doses. So in essence, if we're waiting for the vaccine, the earliest, if we're lucky, and again, there are so many different approaches being used and so many different experiments going on because of the size of it, that I think that we can bet on something happening on the vaccine front. But basically, that vaccine will bring us out of lockdown somewhere in the early part of next year. So until then, most countries will have to stay under some form of lockdown. But that brings me to the economic effects of a lockdown. and also the ability of various countries and governments to lock down or not. So the Blair Foundation, again, my own guesstimate of what happens when you go into hard lockdown, the way we are now, is that around 50% of people in the economy basically stop working. So about 50% of people are either in essential jobs or they are in the situation where they can work from home. So I'm working normal hours. You can see I'm dressed up in my suit and tie. Normal stuff for me in terms of working hours, but only about 50% of people would be working. And in that process, you lose roughly 30% of everything that is being produced. Remember, a lot of stuff that's produced in the economy is not produced by people. So if you're renting a house, then that house, you're living in that house and value is being produced by that house, but no person is actually working in that house. So there's a higher percentage of people losing their jobs or not being active in their jobs for the moment than you lose in terms of actual GDP. So in terms of GDP numbers, my own estimate is that you lose about 30% in hard lockdown. Tony Blair Foundation has come out and said that they think about 25% of GDP is being lost. And I will say to you, I think that the economic effects of 25 or 30% are actually very similar. So I'm not going to dispute the 25%. But we lose about a third of production when we go into hard lockdown. And that has massive implications for the economy. And we'll go through that in a second. But it's basically unlike anything we've seen, definitely since the 1918 flu epidemic. Nothing else in between comes even close to the economic effects of this lockdown. So from an economic point of view, this is completely over the top. We've never seen anything like it. And basically, the last time that we had an epidemic of this sort, the Spanish flu, governments didn't have the ability to enforce lockdowns like they do now. So it's a completely different circumstance and basically completely unprecedented. And we see that all around us every day. So that's the first phase of lockdown. But that assumes that the government can enforce a strict lockdown. So we're already seeing the signs that the lockdown in South Africa is not as strict as the lockdown would be, let's say, in a place like Singapore or Hong Kong or Taiwan. So typically, small countries who are isolated will be able to lock down very strictly. Large companies with larger countries with lots of land borders, much more difficult to lock down, but also the level of sophistication of the economy. So developed countries would have a much greater ability to lock down. Now, in Singapore, for instance, they had a very successful lockdown initially, and now they find that in terms of the imported workers who live in quite dire circumstances in Singapore, the virus has spread very, very quickly. So they're actually getting a resurgence of the virus among the poorer population. So poor people who live in close proximity to each other are more vulnerable than people who live in large houses in luxurious circumstances. So in South Africa, you've got both. You've got people who live in large houses in luxurious circumstances, but you also have a lot of people who live in dire circumstances and right on top of each other. And things like taking a taxi to work, social distancing and taking a taxi to work don't really actually live together very easily because there's all kinds of reasons to think that taxis are a really crowded place and that you could pick up the virus very quickly. So what we're seeing in South Africa is that in spite of very strict lockdown rules, the number of infections are still growing. So the number of infections hasn't gone to naught the way that it should in terms of hard lockdown. So our view basically is that you have countries who can maintain lockdowns and can maintain intelligent lockdowns. So in the Netherlands, for instance, the Prime Minister has come out and said, I'm going to ask you to maintain social distancing, but we're going to treat each other like adults. I'm not going to make all kinds of rules and try to enforce them. I'm going to tell you that it's dangerous to be out and that you should, for your own sake and for the sake of your fellow citizens, you should keep your distance, but I'm not going to actually make too many rules. So in South Africa, we seem to have found an excuse to make rules. So we make a rule like you cannot sell cigarettes, or you cannot transport alcohol, and so on. Kind of completely off the charts, silly rules that we can't really enforce. So everybody, every smoker in South Africa now knows the location of the nearest Shabib. So do you think people have stopped smoking? Absolutely not. They're just buying cigarettes from a different source. So in South Africa, we can't actually enforce our lockdown very strictly. And that means that eventually the virus will spread through the population. And in fact, in South Africa, you will see that the government basically accepts as much. They say that we have bought ourselves some time through the lockdown and slowed the spread of the virus down, but the epidemic is coming and we need to prepare ourselves for the epidemic. So I think that is correct. I think that in South Africa, we will see the epidemic. And what that actually means is that in South Africa, we are likely to acquire herd immunity long before countries like Britain or Italy or Germany acquire herd immunity. So even though Italy has had a very intense epidemic, a very low percentage of the population would have been exposed to the virus because they shut the economy down way before there could be a spread into the general population. Now, again, in Italy is a bit of a special case. The north of Italy, where the virus erupted, is actually pretty much a developed country, but the south of Italy is much more like a developing country. So we're still waiting to see what the epidemic will be like in the south of Italy and whether they will be able to strictly enforce the lockdowns. So in essence, you get countries that will enforce the lockdown, like Germany, and you get countries that can't enforce the lockdown, like South Africa and Mexico and Brazil and Indonesia and probably India and so on. And in those countries, a lot of people will die, and it will be tragic from a human point of view, but the virus will pass fairly much more quickly. So 3-4 months from now, we'll probably be in a situation where we're saying that was it, that was the epidemic for South Africa. So South Africa, by the end of the year, will have mostly an open economy. But in that open economy, we still won't be able to trade and interact with the rest of the world. So the tourist industry will not get back because people will not come to South Africa from other countries where they maintain strict lockdown. So even though we would be out of lockdown, the economy would be nowhere close to normal. So what happens in the second phase of lockdown is that you lose about 10% of GDP. And again, my own thumbsuck estimate and the Tony Blair Institute's estimate, spot on the same, saying you'll still lose 10% of GDP. Now, if you're losing somewhere between 30% and 10% of GDP, this has some very severe implications for the economy. So what we basically see is that the economy is going into a severe recession. So recession is defined as something where production falls. So production falls by between 10 and 30%. So we're definitely seeing a recession. And what we see is that recession is of unprecedented seriousness. So if we could go to the jobless claims graph, please. So just to give you an idea of the unprecedented nature of this, we've got a graph, one of the earliest indications we get of how things are in the economy. In the US, they have a statistic that they release about jobless claims, new jobless claims in any specific week. So that graph basically says that from the time that the statistic has been kept up, which is roughly from the 1950s, there's never been a time where more than 600,000 people in a specific week has filed new claims for
Wikus,
unemployment.
I haven't got that picture on the screen.
Yes, we don't have the picture on the screen yet. We'll get it in a second. But what you can see now is that we've now got 3 weeks of statistics that comes post the lockdown. And what we see in the United States is that there's been a massive increase in the unemployment rate. We seem to have a bit of trouble getting PowerPoint to be fully cooperative on Teams.
It's very slow response.
It's responding very slowly, so I'll just continue. We'll show the graph in a second. But basically what happened is that the first partial week of shutdown, there were 3 million claims for unemployment insurance. And in the subsequent 2 weeks, there were 6 million every week. And then in the fourth week, 5.7 million claims for unemployment. So in a situation where we've never seen more than 600,000 in any previous recession, we're seeing that we have, we'll get there in a second, we're seeing massive unemployment coming through. There we go. There's the first week, 3.5. And then if you go to the second one, there's the second week. So close on 7 million. So what we've seen is out of a total working population of 165 million people, roughly in the US, around 20 million people have lost their jobs formally and are now claiming unemployment insurance after 4 weeks of lockdown. So this is, if you're thinking about off the charts, you would never have had the runway on your chart to have 7 million. So this is literally an off the charts event. So there's a massive, massive, massive impact from the economic point of view. And so what we're seeing is a real meltdown of the economy, meaning everything comes to a standstill. And the way that you have to think about this is a little bit like saying, I'm putting my patient, if I can have a medical analogy for this, you're putting your patient into an induced coma. You are making sure that your patient don't move around. So in fact, what happens is the moment that you put your patient into a coma, the first thing you have to do is you also have to put up a glucose drip. So you have to just feed the patient, otherwise the patient will die. So what we've seen in South Africa now is it took us about 4 weeks, but we've now got a drip into the patient. So we're actually giving poverty relief and income relief to those people who are losing their jobs and are not allowed to work. So we are starting to do something that will just prevent hunger and starvation. And around the world in developing countries, we are more and more hearing the cry, I would rather die of COVID than die of hunger. Because literally, if you continue with lockdown without helping people, people will die of hunger. Now, in the US, what they've done is they've announced a $2 trillion relief package. So they call it a stimulus bill, but it's really not stimulus because how can you stimulate a patient that's lying in an induced coma? What you actually have is it's just disaster relief. So effectively, they've got $2 trillion of disaster relief going into the economy, and we're already seeing that running out. So they've announced another $487 billion of disaster relief yesterday. So $2.5 trillion. So $2.5 trillion of stimulus going into the economy, plus the Federal Reserve has come to the aid of markets and also started buying all kinds of instruments that they wouldn't normally buy in the markets. Now, one of the funny things then that's happened is to see what happened in the investment markets once the economy grinds to a standstill. So maybe let me just finish what I think will happen with economics. The thing that will happen is, first of all, you'll have this lockdown, but at the end of the lockdown, you actually have dire economic circumstances. Because if you have a lockdown that lasts up to 9 months in various forms, some hard lockdown and some soft lockdown, what happens is that a large number of the participants in the economy will have great pressure on their balance sheets. So if you're thinking about businesses, you probably have about 20% of businesses who do better in these circumstances than normal. The Netflix and the Zooms of the world will flourish. Then you probably have about 60% of businesses who will find a way to survive. So they'll have much lower turnover, but they'll find a way to survive. But they, in that process of surviving, they will use up any cash they have, and they will make use of a lot of loans. So they will come out of the crisis with massively weakened balance sheets. And then you'll have about 30% of businesses who will fail. So 30% of businesses will not make it through this. So even in China, where this started in the first quarter, just within a couple of months of the lockdown happening, we know that there has been 460,000 bankruptcies in China alone. So obviously a lot of those businesses are small businesses, but small businesses are basically the backbone of the economy. So what you see is a massive impact on the balance sheets and quite a lot of bankruptcies in the business community. So what happens to businesses when they come out on the other side? Do they go straight back to normal? And the answer is absolutely not. So businesses will go to great lengths to try to rebuild their balance sheets, meaning they will not invest any money into expansion. They will use any cash they have to improve their balance sheet. So they'll hoard cash because they will have come to the conclusion that it's prudent to have much more cash around than they had before. Plus, they will try to pay down their debt. So businesses will not be investing. Now, a lack of business investing is the most common cause of recessions around the world. So in fact, just the lack of business investment will cause a deep recession. So once we come out of the coronavirus crisis, we will find ourselves in the middle of a deep and potentially long-lasting recession. Because the other participant in the economy, individuals or consumers, will also have their balance sheets under severe pressure. So some people will have a bit of extra money to spend. So if you were getting your salary like normal, but you didn't have, you couldn't go shopping, then you'll have a little bit of extra cash lying around and some unfulfilled desires. So you'll go out and eat a steak, and you'll go out and you'll buy some nice clothing and definitely some makeup and all of those type of things. But effectively, it will be a small percentage of people who have money left. Switching for network. My apologies, my network connection was interrupted for a second. But what you'll have is you'll have some people who have lost their jobs and have basically been reduced to poverty. Those people will be buying down. They will find the cheapest possible place to live, and they will spend as little money as possible, and they'll just try to survive. And then you'll get the average person who has been on a reduced wage for a long time or have had some kind of aid, but those balance sheets will again be under great pressure. So there's going to be a severe lack of consumer confidence. Now again, a severe lack of consumer confidence, a normal feature of a deep recession, except that in this case, it will be much more widespread than usual. And then the third participant is government. Now, governments will also see their balance sheets massively impacted. So if you think about the South African government, we have now announced a rescue package or an aid package of 500 billion rands, roughly 10% of GDP. That means we're going to increase the level of debt from 60% of GDP to 70% of GDP within 1 year. But that's not actually even the extent of it, because at the same time, there will be a collapse of tax income, meaning the growth in debt will be much larger than 10% of GDP. So we're going into this with debt to GDP ratio of about 55%, we're unlikely to come out on the other side with a debt of less than 90% of GDP, and we'll probably come out with 100% of GDP as our debt ratio, which is typically a place where governments would be taking extreme measures to try to reduce debt. So even the government will be under pressure on the other side of this. But governments will have learned to intervene much more actively in the economy than they have ever before. So what we find is whenever you have these crises, governments come to the rescue, and they then stay much more involved in the economy afterwards than they were before. So a bigger role for government, unfortunately, given our lack of good government. It's not really good news that governments will play a larger role. But what governments will do is they will try to stimulate the economy by having massive infrastructure projects. So in fact, South Africa was the first country in the world to announce a third stage of the economic reaction to COVID. And already the president last night spoke about a massive infrastructure project. So what happens to the patient is once the patient gets out of bed, you now have to inject massive amounts of steroids to get the patient to go back to health and to start building muscle. And really, infrastructure project is the one thing that governments could spend on that gives them massive stimulation effect to the economy, but also adds assets to the balance sheet of the government. So governments around the world will be investing heavily into infrastructure once this is passed, and that will be a feature of the economy for multiple years. So probably a 5-year period starting in 2021, massive infrastructure projects happening all around the world. And obviously with infrastructure projects, they need to be planned first. So this will gather speed over time. So, but just the announcement, in fact, will already have stimulatory effect. So let me quickly spend the last 5 minutes that we've got on the effect on markets. So what we've done is to say, the one thing that we've actually found quite puzzling is the reaction of markets to this disaster. Because clearly what we're going into is a recession that is significantly deeper than the credit crunch of 2008, 2009. In 2008, 2009, stock markets went down 60% on average worldwide. And so what you actually need to see is, in this case, the reaction should be larger than that. And what we're seeing at the moment is that stock markets are about 20% lower than they were before the crisis, at which point they were at record highs. So we think that there's still a massive amount of adjustment that needs to happen in markets. But the markets have been really slow and reluctant to adjust. So we've actually been thinking about why is it that that markets are not adjusting to this disaster in anything like the way we think they should adjust. Now, the one market that has adjusted quite rapidly is the oil market. So those of you who follow these things will know that oil traded at a negative price for the first time ever yesterday, well, actually the day before. So the day before yesterday, the price of oil in some places actually went to a negative situation, meaning oil producers were paying other people to just take the oil off their hands. Because oil, you may know, you need to treat oil in a very specific way, so otherwise you're illegal. So actually, what you need to do is you need to get someone who can treat the oil in the correct way, and you need to pay them to do that. So actually, the price of oil has gone negative in some parts of the world. So that's the kind of impact that you would expect. But in effect, the oil price has come down from roughly $60 per barrel to roughly $15 per barrel. So about a 75% fall in oil prices. And we think that correctly reflects the harm in the oil market. But stock markets on the whole only down about 20%. So we think that's actually kind of off the charts, not the right way to treat this. So what we think is that this is actually a fantastic opportunity for our clients to get out of the market. because we believe that there will be an opportunity once the depth of this crisis becomes apparent to everybody around the world. Stock markets will have another massive down leg. Now, effectively, what we believe is that we'll see a classical bear market, meaning the market will go up and down, but on average, every up will be slightly smaller than the next down. And in the end, we'll end up roughly 60% lower than we started. So we are patiently waiting for markets to adjust to the reality of the dire circumstances out there. And it's interesting that if you see market commentators, they say, well, we get a V-shaped recovery, the virus is coming under control, we'll go back to normal very quickly. And this is also something that the president in the United States wants to propagate because he wants to get re-elected. We'll go back to normal very quickly. Our view is completely different from that, and it's hard to find serious economists who have a different view to that. So virtually all serious economists you talk to say that we will come out of the virus problem in a severe recession, and that severe recession will take years to dissipate. So that's what we expect. So we actually think that markets will bottom somewhere towards the end of the year, but it'll probably bottom roughly 60% below where they started, which means that markets have to roughly halve still from the point where we are now.